Hello, and this is Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, something that has been very much looked forward to by a great many people according to the Kickstarter, which was one of the most successful gaming Kickstarters in a long time. I believe it made like over $6 million in something like 32 days. So yeah, people wanted this for sure, and they have been sort of tentatively looking forward to it, hoping after some, high-profile Kickstarter failures, no names, that it wouldn't end up like that and would end up more like something like, Hollow Knight or Divinity Original Sin. Just one of those games that took the ideas of its Kickstarter and ran with them and made something amazing. And, well, they kind of have. So this was made by, of course, Koji, the venerable Koji Igarashi, the guy that was sort of skyrocketed to fame in the late 90s when he made Castlevania Symphony of the Night, very obviously the namesake of this game. And he continued to make the Castlevanias, the Metroidvania sort of style of Castlevanias, all the way forward to, Castlevania Order of Ecclesia on the DS, which, unpopular opinion, is actually my favorite Castlevania, I know. And there were a lot of sort of Symphony of the Night-based ideas and promises and things, and people were sort of looking forward to a revival of that game, or of that style of game, from the guy who actually helped create the genre himself. And that's sort of what we have here, although, one thing I want to say first off is that even though there's definitely a lot of references and a lot of atmosphere and things that are similar to Symphony of the Night, the game actually plays a lot more like one of the DS titles, namely the Sorrow games, Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow, as well as Order of Ecclesia, because it has that kind of large collection thing going on where you're meant to go around the castle and collect all sorts of, well, things. Obviously, it depends on which game you're talking about, but let's start with the shard system, because the shard system is very much like collecting souls from the Sorrow games, where pretty much every enemy has a droppable shard, and with a sort of low drop rate. Sometimes you have to kill them multiple times, of course, save for bosses, and eventually they will drop their shard and you will get some sort of ability from it. And the system works very, very similarly to Souls from the Sorrow games, in the fact that, you're kind of going to go around collecting these from, like, various enemies that you want to see what they do. You can kind of guess what the souls may do, and you kind of want it to find out. And there are different categories of shards, like there are sort of multiple active shards, and there are the passive ones, and there are even familiars, back very much in their Symphony of the Night style, but even more useful, in my opinion, because they actually suck less. So a big part of the normal gameplay will be going from room to room, area to area, and trying to collect the various shards and empower yourself with them from all the enemies. And of course there are the boss shards that tend to be things that you need to progress, very Metroidvania of course, so you'll come across lots of high ledges that you can't reach at first until you get the double jump shard, and walls that you may not be able to get past until you get something else, and movable objects, for instance, that you can't move yet. All the classic Metroidvania staples as kind of envisioned by Koji, I suppose you could say, so they're all here. And the actual castle exploration is definitely very Castlevania-esque, but I would say the areas and the general feel of the castle is definitely Symphony of the Night. If I was to compare it to any of the mainline games, that would be the one that comes to mind immediately, and the variety in areas is pretty good, and is also kind of similar to a lot of the other Castlevanias, of course, where you have, you have the clock tower area, which is infuriating, as it always is, and it is in this case, and has even a very sort of reminiscent of the older clock tower areas soundtracks. They have, I'm sure, deliberately done that, because the person who's doing the soundtrack for this game is the person who did the Metroidvania, Castlevania soundtracks, so that's all here. And you have some other more exotic and outside of the castle, or possibly this reality kind of areas as well, and some other strange things like the underground desert, and pretty much all of what you would expect. So I guess that kind of begs the question, do you have to like Castlevania to like this game? And really, it stands on its own. In my opinion, at least, it is a game that, although is of course very reminiscent of his previous games, because that was part of the promise for the Kickstarter, it also doesn't need knowledge or enjoyment of the previous games to actually understand it and be able to like it yourself. It helps, of course, and there are many references to the previous games, but it doesn't lean on those so hard that if you don't have any knowledge of them, that you just won't enjoy it at all. It is just a really good 2D Metroidvania with a lot of loot and a lot of collection and stuff like that, and some really fun boss fights. And if that's all you want, then, you don't have to have the Castlevania nostalgia or whatever to actually enjoy this. It just so happens that it definitely does catch on to that hook that a lot of people have had for a long time, that Konami has stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Thus, this game. Everything, even down to the movement, is actually very similar if you've played those games, because you have a somewhat slow walking speed, which is exactly how it's always been. You know, if you look at all the way back to Symphony of the Night and you watch Alucard walk around, he's not particularly fast. He has a somewhat an illusion of being a little bit faster than he is because of the after image effect that happens, which looks really cool even today. But it's, you know, it's slow movement. You don't sprint through the castle or anything like that, but the combat and the actual dodging mechanics and the like are very much based around jumping and backdashing, which are available in this game as well. And you do, of course, get a double jump fairly early on, and you can even upgrade the double jump to give you immunity frames during the second jump. So you can use it for more direct dodging, and you can also get items to upgrade your backdash and make it go farther so that you kind of move out of the way a little bit quicker. So very much in the vein of the previous Castlevanias, this is, you know, based on that extremely specific movement system that some people just don't get along with very well, because I think its pace is a little bit slow. But it also means that things like jump attacking and angling your projectiles and the like by jumping, which is very much a staple of these games, is here, and it works very well. Now, there is lots and lots of loot. I did mention loot. There are tons of weapons and pieces of armor and accessories and the like to actually equip yourself with. One nice little note that I mentioned in this game, or that I noticed in this game rather, is that even though your main armor doesn't show on your character, the 2 accessory slots and your hat slot actually do, as well as a scarf. So your character can actually be customized a fair amount in terms of, like, you know, visually. Miriam has a lot of different looks that you can actually go through, which is sort of neat, because in the previous games, normally you would really only see your weapon. So it's kind of cool to have all of the other bits and bobs that you attach to yourself, except for your armor, actually show physically. And there's also an NPC that you can find quite early on that allows you to customize your hair, the hair color, the color of your actual appearance, you know, your just general colors that you walk around with, and some other things like that. So there is some appearance customization in this. As far as the loot itself, it really takes more of the form of the Sorrow games, where there's just like a huge variety of many different things. You know, Symphony of the Night had lots of loot, of course, but not quite as much as those later games, and this is definitely in the vein of the later ones. There's a lot of variety, especially in weapons and things, and there are of course, the classic weapons that you can get, like Graham and the other named weapons, that you can find and then upgrade to other various forms from the crafting feature. There is actually a crafting system in this game, and similar to the kind of pseudo-crafting that was in something like Dawn of Sorrow, where you would get specific souls and a certain weapon, and then you could sort of evolve that weapon into a higher form. There are lots and lots of weapons that you actually make from previous weapons, and specific kind of rare materials that you have to go around and find to make the sort of legendary named Castlevania weapons, as it were, and all the things that you'll be familiar with. Another thing that they have actually taken from Symphony of the Night are the techniques. If you remember, in that game you had a sort of like fighting game-like input that you could do to do certain movesets with different weapons. It very much depended on what you were equipped with, and not all of them could do anything, but certain weapons could do certain moves. For instance, I remember almost all the katanas in Symphony of the Night had like a sort of down-forward attack motion, like a fireball motion, that would teleport you forward and make you do this sort of like vortex of slashes in front of yourself, a sort of judgment cut like move, which was pretty neat. And they have kept that sort of system and actually made it a little bit more official in this game, because if you remember in Symphony, there was really no way to tell. You just sort of found this out. They weren't like written down in the game or anything like that. You could just do them. But in this case, you can actually find these various bookshelves that are in front of most of the save rooms and a couple of other areas in the castle. And while some of them have lore on them, a lot of them will have instead these recordable bits of techniques that you can actually use with different weapons. It'll tell you the sort of list of weapons that it can be used with and the actual command to do it. You don't have to find these to actually do them. If you just, you know, do the motion, it will work. But this helps you know which weapons can do what, which is pretty cool. And the techniques also have an experience system. When using them, they will build an experience bar, and when they max out, that allows you to actually use them with other weapons of that category. So if you use like the power attack with one of the swords, that can use the power attack. If you max out its experience meter, you'll be able to use that power attack with any other sword type weapon, even if it doesn't normally do it. The exception to this would be that some like very high level boss weapons and special weapons have exclusive skills, you know, like a one-use exclusive skill that only they can use. Like, for instance, this boss right now, you can get her umbrella and use it to fire out that, like, homing blood projectile that she uses, and those do not have, like, an experience meter. They can't be mastered because only that weapon can use them. To talk about the boss fights, they are pretty good. There are a lot of them. Sometimes you'll actually have a couple like back-to-back just because of how many there are, but they are generally spread around the castle as you would expect. And they do have the sort of Castlevania boss feel, you know, where there's lots of different moves with different tells that you have to memorize and avoid in different ways, which I have done kind of horribly in the background here because this is like my first time fighting this boss. And it's actually pretty cool. The bosses, of course, have different health amounts and different resistances and things, but just like the classic Castlevanias, there are no health bars or anything like that, so you just sort of have to see the damage that your attacks do and then understand by the number of hits that they've taken and the sort of amount of time you've been in the fight, and if they, you know, they tend to sort of turn red, you know, either literally or figuratively, as in they get tougher and transition into like a second phase. Very Castlevania-esque, and it's all here, and it works just fine. I will say that the overall difficulty of the bosses and really just the game in general is more along the lines of like the Symphony and the Sorrow games. Like it's not an easy game, but it's not super difficult. It's definitely not like Order of Ecclesia difficult. That game would like rip your face off if you weren't careful. It was really hard. And this is not that hard, although this is of course normal mode. There is a hard mode and a nightmare mode, as well as a New Game Plus. And from what I understand, the New Game Plus is actually not just, you know, playing the game again, but with everything from the start. It's actually kind of like Dark Souls 2's New Game Plus, it sounds like it adds new enemies to other areas and like increases the spawns of various things and stuff like that. So it is a bit of a different beast on New Game Plus rather than just being the same thing again, which I always like it when devs actually do that. They put some extra effort into the New Game Plus to make it a different adventure, I guess you could say, rather than the same thing, just maybe slightly harder. The enemy variety is fantastic. It's exactly what you would expect for a Castlevania game, with lots of, you know, just mythologies from around the world, have different enemies, from like demons to weird angelic things to just other legends and like cryptozoology level stuff, and there's just all sorts of weird things, just exactly like you would expect from a game like this, and they're all definitely here, and it does the similar like sort of Castlevania thing where every enemy has kind of a certain rule set that you have to learn in terms of their patterns and their attacks, and the difficulty comes from when these enemies show up in rooms with other enemies and you have to sort of combine your knowledge of them to live and stuff like that. It's a good way to do things, and it's, you know, it's a venerable and very old school way to do things, at least in Symphony, and it works here. And the overall exploration is also really, really good because, as you would expect, there are secrets like everywhere, just breakable walls all over the place, with like max health, max MP, and max bullet capacity upgrades, because there are actually firearms in this game, and they can use different... You have like an infinite ammo, just basic bullet thingy that you can use, but you can get all sorts of other ammunition as well that is a lot more limited, but is a lot more powerful in certain ways. And the exploration is also, interestingly enough, kind of necessary to progress, because just like a lot of the older games, it doesn't really tell you where to go most of the time. If you look at forums, you'll see just tons of people like, where do I go? And that's because it doesn't really tell you. There are lots of little, you know, hints throughout the text. If you listen to the dialogue, there will be people that mention certain places to go or certain things you could do, but it doesn't like outright tell you where to go now and give you like a marker on your map or anything. You are meant to explore and experiment yourself, and the game very much focuses on that. You know, for instance, after you beat that particular boss that I showed earlier, the vampire boss named Bloodless, she gives you her Bloodsteal ability, which is very much like Soul Steel that Alucard uses from Symphony of the Night, but in this case it is a little more red. And you can actually use it to drain this huge bloody fountain that you saw earlier in the game, like when you first entered the castle, and you may not have even remembered that it was there, but it is there, and you need to do that to progress, and that's just sort of how the game works. Cooking is also very important, by the way, because not only does food act as very useful healing items, but the first time you eat a new food for the first time, it will give you a stat bonus, a permanent stat bonus. Every food has a specific one that they can give you, and it's very much worth getting as many as you can, because it's a very good method to increase your stats aside from leveling up and getting new gear. Overall, I think it's a really, really good game. I think it's pretty fantastic. It was pretty much exactly what was promised, and maybe a little bit more, because there are going to be something ridiculous, like 17 free DLCs released after this game, and including like 2 new characters to play as, multiple new game modes, including some sort of roguelike mode that I will almost certainly cover when it comes out. So yeah, I would say that the $40, by the way, that this game costs is very much worth it if you enjoy these types of games, or if you have a lot of love for Castlevania in general. It is an extremely good entry, technically, in the series, you could say, unofficially, that hasn't lost anything in its transition to the modern day. So that is Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, everyone. The link is, of course, below in the description, so check it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.